Before we get to the story, I'd like to say thanks so much for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading cosmic horror related stories every single day. So if that sounds good, please drop a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a lot, especially when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. I walk pipelines for a living. That's the whole job, more or less. You get the section assignment, you get the survey maps and the pressure logs and the anomaly flags from the previous inspection, and then you walk 8, sometimes 10 miles a day across whatever the land is doing in that particular stretch, checking the marker posts, logging anything that looks like subsidence or erosion over the buried line, noting anything that's changed since the last walk. The pipeline is underground and you never see it, but you learn to read the ground above it the way you learn to read anything you've spent enough time with. The land talks if you know what you're listening for. I've been doing this for 12 years across 5 states: New Mexico, Utah, West Texas, the eastern edge of Arizona, a stretch of southern Colorado that nearly killed me in a February that had no business being that cold. I'm not romantic about it. It pays well, it keeps me outside, and it asks for exactly the kind of attention I'm good at giving, steady and sustained and without drama. I've never found anything on a walk that wasn't eventually explainable by geology or weather or the decisions of whoever did the original survey. I've flagged erosion that turned out to be significant, and pressure anomalies that turned out to be nothing, and documentation discrepancies that got corrected and forgotten. I've never filed a report that brought 14 people to my motel. This is that report. The New Mexico section was a 12-day job, a stretch of buried gas infrastructure running through scrubland about 40 miles east of nowhere useful, flat and dry and identical in every direction. The kind of terrain that looks like the same square mile of desert, reproduced indefinitely. The marker posts ran toward the horizon in their straight line, and I followed them the way I always do. Steady pace, eyes on the ground, and the posts in alternation, logging in the handheld every quarter mile. Day 3 of the section, about 6 miles in. Good weather, light wind. Nothing in the pressure logs flagging anything unusual for the stretch ahead. I was thinking about the lunch I had in my pack and whether I wanted it at mile 7 or mile 8, which is the level of drama a typical inspection walk generates. Then the markers angled, not by much, 15 degrees roughly, a deviation that started cleanly and ran for what I later paced out at about 400 feet before angling back to the original heading, a long shallow detour, the shape of it on the ground like a narrow ellipse drawn around an oval patch of scrubland that looked exactly like the scrubland on either side of it. Same dry grass, same pale soil, same scatter of low brush. Nothing visibly different about the ground inside the oval. Pipeline reroutes are not unusual. Geological features, high water tables, contaminated soil from prior land use, any number of things push a route of the original heading during survey. The difference is that reroutes are documented. There is always a notation in the survey records explaining why the line goes around something instead of through it. I have those records and I know how to read them, and I had been reading them on and off since the start of the section. The records for this stretch showed a straight line, no deviation, no notation. The route on paper ran straight through the oval the physical markers were going around. I noted it in the handheld as a documentation discrepancy, the standard flag for when what's in the ground doesn't match what's on the paper, and I kept walking. I planned to follow up in the report the way I followed up on all of them. A call to the survey records office, a request for the original field notes from the construction period, the usual process. Then I reached the arroyo at the far end of the section, and everything about the day changed. The arroyo was maybe 20 feet deep at the point where the pipeline markers passed closest to it, a cut in the desert floor that had been working itself deeper for a long time. The walls showed the stratification clearly, the way arroyo walls do when erosion has been patient enough. Dark and light bands of soil layered like the pages of something very old, each layer representing a period of accumulation that I had no way to date, but that clearly represented a significant span of time. In the exposed face of the arroyo wall, running through multiple layers of that stratified soil, was something that wasn't soil. I stood at the edge of the arroyo for a moment before I went down into it, because I wanted to look at it from a distance first. What I could see from the edge was a surface, dark and uniform, in a way the surrounding material wasn't uniform, curving slightly at its visible portion in a way that told me it was the outer face of something much larger that extended into the wall on both sides. Whatever I was looking at, the arroyo had cut through the edge of it, and what was visible was a cross-section of the outer surface at roughly mid-depth in the arroyo wall, bracketed above and below by layered soil that had been accumulating on top of and around it for long enough that the layers were numerous and distinct. No seams, no joins, no indication of assembled components or construction in any sense I recognized. Just a surface, dark and slightly curved, embedded in the ground, the way things are embedded when they've been there long enough that the ground has simply built up around them. I went down into the arroyo. Up close, the surface had a texture I don't have a useful word for. Not smooth exactly, not rough exactly, something that existed between those descriptions in a way that made both of them feel inadequate. I took photographs, a series of them at different distances, and then I did something I've thought about every day since, which is that I reached out and touched it. A second, maybe two. The surface was cool, cooler than the surrounding soil, despite the fact that we were in direct sun in the middle of the afternoon. And then I noticed the handheld had gone dark. I looked at it. The display was off. I pressed the power button and nothing happened, which shouldn't have been possible because I'd put a fresh battery in that morning and the charge indicator had been showing full when I went down into the arroyo. I stepped back from the surface, one step and then another, putting maybe 5 feet between me and the arroyo wall. The handheld powered on. I stood in the arroyo floor and looked at the instrument in my hand, and then at the surface in the wall, and then at the instrument again. I put it through its startup sequence. It ran normally. Every reading nominal, the battery at full charge, no logged error. I took 3 more photographs of the surface and climbed out of the arroyo and finished the walk. That evening I filed my report. I described the documentation discrepancy, the reroute without notation, the exposed surface in the arroyo wall, the instrument anomaly. I attached the photographs. I flagged it for follow-up in the standard way. 14 hours later, there was a knock at my motel room door. They were professional about it. I want to be clear about that because I think the way it went says something about how practiced the process was. No pressure, no theatre, just 4 people in a motel room asking questions in a sequence that felt casual and wasn't. A woman named Caris led it. She was somewhere in her 40s, unhurried, the kind of person who had done enough of these conversations that she'd stopped needing to try hard at them. The other 3 asked follow-up questions when she left pauses for them to. They went through the walk in detail, the reroute when I noticed it, how I characterized it in the moment, whether I'd had any prior indication of it from the records or from the previous inspection report, the arroyo when I first saw the surface, how long I looked at it before going down, what I thought it was when I first saw it from the edge, the photographs, what order I took them in, whether I'd shared them with anyone. Then they took the handheld and the camera. Caris told me they were needed for technical assessment and would be returned when the assessment was complete. They were returned 3 days later, along with a new camera of the same make and a new handheld of the same spec. Everything on both devices had been cleared to factory settings. The photographs were gone. Before the first interview was over, I asked what was in the ground. Caris said the area was being secured for geological assessment purposes. I said I understood that and asked what was in the ground. She said the assessment would determine the nature and extent of any geological anomaly and that I'd be kept informed of any findings relevant to the pipeline. I've been told things aren't going to be answered before in the direct way of being told, and I've been told things aren't going to be answered in the indirect way of Caris describing geological assessment in a motel room at 7 in the morning. Both communicate the same information. I stopped asking and let them finish. The second interview was the next afternoon. Same questions in a different order, which I recognized as consistency checking and which I passed, presumably, because the tone didn't change. Caris asked about touching the surface toward the end of the second interview. She asked exactly how long contact lasted. I told her a second, maybe 2. She asked if I'd noticed anything during or after. I told her I'd noticed the instrument, and that was all. She looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone evaluating an answer rather than receiving it, and then she moved on. I thought about that moment for the next 3 days. The lockdown from where I was standing was invisible from a distance and obvious up close. The highway through the area ran normally, trucks and the occasional car, nothing that announced itself as unusual. But the access road to the pipeline section head, which I drove out to on the second morning out of something I can only call the need to confirm, was blocked at the turnoff by a plain vehicle and 2 people who were politely and completely uninterested in letting me through. They had my name, which told me they'd been told to expect the attempt. I went back to the motel and sat on the bed and thought about 12 years of walking pipelines and the things I'd logged and the things I hadn't, and the difference between a documentation discrepancy and a decision made by a survey team to route around something and collectively not write down why. That evening, I ended up in the motel's small common area talking to a man named Fitch, who had been ranching land in that part of New Mexico for most of his life. I didn't approach it directly. I asked about the land, the way you ask about land with someone who's been on it for decades, and Fitch talked the way ranchers talk when someone is willing to listen. which is thoroughly and without particular concern for staying on one subject. He talked about the arroyo eventually, not because I steered toward it, but because the land in that stretch led there. He said the arroyo had been cutting deeper his whole life, and his father had said the same, and his father's father. He said the ranchers in the area had always left that particular ground alone, the stretch around the deep part of the cut, without any formal agreement to do so. Just a consensus that built up over generations through nothing more official than sensible people having the same instinct independently. He said the cattle had never grazed within half a mile of it, wouldn't be pushed there. Dogs wouldn't go near it, working dogs that went everywhere else they were sent. He said some ground had something wrong with it, and the animals knew it before the people did. He said it without any particular weight, the way you say things that have always been true. I thanked him and went back to my room and sat with it. Karis came back on day 3 with a specific question. She sat down across from me and went through a few items from the previous interviews, clarifying points, the kind of thing that either was genuinely clerical or was a way of arriving at the real question without appearing to arrive at it. Then she asked about the moment of contact again. How long? What I noticed. Then she asked if I'd noticed anything in the days since. I asked her to be specific. She said anything out of the ordinary, physically, cognitively, anything that had seemed different. I told her no. She looked at me with the evaluating expression again, and I held it and said no again, and she moved on. But the question told me something, the same way the first question about contact had told me something. There was a specific answer she was checking for. Either she got it or she didn't, and I'd said no, and she'd moved on rather than pursued it, and I wasn't certain which of those outcomes that represented. I asked her how old the structure was. She said geological assessment was ongoing. I asked why the original survey team routed the pipeline around it without documentation. She said records from that period of the project were incomplete. I asked why the cattle wouldn't graze near the arroyo. She looked at her notepad for a moment, and then she didn't answer that one, which was its own kind of answer. I asked what predates the geological record meant in terms of years. She picked up her bag, thanked me for my cooperation, and told me I'd hear from them with next steps. I was cleared to leave on day 4. My equipment came back that morning in a zippered bag with a printed receipt that itemized everything. New camera, new handheld, identical spec, factory reset. A document to sign that covered the standard ground in the standard language, and that I signed because I was going to sign it regardless, and we both knew that. Karis shook my hand. She gave me a card with a number on it and told me to direct any media inquiries there. I asked one more time what it was. She said it predated the survey and the land use records and the available geological record for the formation. She said the assessment was ongoing. She said it the way you say something when you're giving a true answer that has been carefully selected for what it doesn't include. I asked what predates the geological record meant as an actual number. She thanked me for my time and left. I'm writing this at a rest stop 2 hours north of the area. The truck is running, the heater is going, and I've been sitting here for 40 minutes because I needed somewhere to be. That wasn't the motel and wasn't the road yet. I've been thinking about the instrument, not about the structure itself, Not about the scale of what I saw in the Arroyo wall, not about what Fitch said the cattle had always known, about the instrument and what it was doing when the battery dropped to 0. My handheld does 2 things. It reads the pipeline, pressure and flow, and the variables of buried infrastructure in the section above it. And it has a secondary sensor, a ground conductivity reader, for detecting soil anomalies that might affect the line. I've used it maybe twice in 12 years, both times in sections with prior industrial contamination where the soil composition was potentially relevant to the pipeline's integrity. When I was standing in that arroyo, the instrument had been running its standard cycle, and the secondary sensor runs as part of that cycle when the unit is in active inspection mode, which it was, which means when the battery dropped to 0 in a radius around the arroyo wall, what the instrument had been doing in the moment before it dropped was reading ground conductivity. And conductivity measures what the ground is doing, the electrical behavior of the soil, and whatever is in it. A conductivity reading in a specific radius that is sufficiently different from the surrounding ground is what would cause a reading anomaly significant enough to register. The battery didn't fail. The instrument didn't malfunction. It recovered completely and immediately when I stepped back and has run normally since. What happened was that the secondary sensor encountered a conductivity reading significant enough to exceed the instrument's measurement range, which caused a fault, which the unit expressed as a shutdown. The structure in the arroyo wall is not inert. The ground around it, in a specific radius, is doing something the ground outside that radius isn't doing, and the conductivity of soil is a measure of what's moving through it. I've thought about the pipeline reroute and the survey team that made it without writing it down. I've thought about a group of professionals standing in that desert with their instruments and their survey equipment and making a collective decision to route 400 feet of buried infrastructure around something in the ground and collectively deciding not to explain why in any document that would outlast their involvement with the project. I've thought about what they found that made them do that and what they discussed about it and what they concluded. I've thought about whether their instruments behaved the way mine did and what they made of it. I've thought about Caris asking whether I noticed anything in the days since. The specific phrasing of it, physically, cognitively. I've thought about the moment of contact, 1 second or 2, the cool surface and the instrument dropping and me stepping back. I've thought about the pause when I said no, and whether the pause meant she believed me or didn't. I've decided I'm not going to think about that anymore. What I'm going to think about is this. I have 12 years of inspection reports across 5 states. I have documentation discrepancies logged in every one of those years, reroutes without notation, deviations from survey records that I have flagged and followed up on through the standard process. Most of them resolved into something ordinary. A geological feature the original team noted informally, and the notation didn't make it into the final record. A water table issue that the survey addressed in the field and the paperwork caught up eventually. Most of them. I've never gone back and looked at the ones that didn't resolve. The ones where the follow-up went nowhere. The records office said the documentation was incomplete. The pipeline company said the section was performing within parameters, and the discrepancy was historical and didn't affect current operations. I filed them and moved on because moving on was the job. I'm going to pull those reports when I get to the Utah section. I'm going to look at the ones that didn't resolve, and I'm going to look at where they are on the map, and I'm going to think about what a survey team finds that makes them route around something and collectively decide not to say so. I don't know how many there are. I think I already know what I'm going to find when I look. I think there are more ovals out there, in more deserts, with more layered soil above more curved surfaces and more ground doing things in a specific radius that instruments can't fully measure. I think the people who built these pipelines found them across decades of survey work and made the same decision every time, quietly and professionally and without documentation. And I think there are people like Caris who respond when someone like me finds one and follows up the wrong way. I think some of those structures are older than the geological record for the formations they're in. I think conductivity means something is still moving through the ground around them. I think 1 second of contact is probably nothing. I'm going to assume it's nothing. I pull back onto the highway. The Utah section starts in 3 days, and I have the survey records already, and the drive north is 7 hours, and somewhere in those records there are probably straight lines on paper that don't match the markers in the ground. I'm going to look at all of them this time. I should have been looking at all of them the whole time.